Forget the Mexican cartels. The deadliest drug ring in history didn't operate out of a jungle hideout. It operated out of a luxury office in Connecticut. And the kingpins didn't wear masks. They wore suits and ties. For decades, the Sackler family hid behind a veil of philanthropy, plastering their name on museums while poisoning American towns. Their weapon wasn't a gun, but a pill, OxyContin. They marketed a chemical cousin of heroin as safe medicine, deliberately igniting an epidemic that has claimed 500,000 American lives, a death toll higher than all U.S. combat casualties since World War II. This is the story of the Sackler Dynasty, a family that proved you can get away with mass murder as long as you're rich enough. Arthur Sackler's secret. Before their billions, there was only poverty. The Sackler Empire was born in the squalid slums of 1920s, Brooklyn. Growing up in the shadow of the Great Depression, the Sackler brothers learned a brutal lesson early. In America, poverty is a death sentence. They watched their immigrant parents struggle for every penny, and it planted a seed of panic deep within them. They didn't just want to be rich. They wanted to be invulnerable. Their obsession with financial security eventually morphed into a monster, driving them to value profits over human life. The patriarch and matriarch, Isaac and Sophie Sackler, were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who had arrived in America before the First World War. They were not wealthy. Isaac ran a small grocery store in Williamsburg, a business that was less an empire and more a daily struggle for survival. The couple had 3 sons: Arthur, born in 1913, Mortimer, born in 1916, and Raymond, born in 1920. These 3 brothers would function for the rest of their lives as a singular, tightly knit, and secretive unit, a triumvirate bound by blood and ambition. The defining trauma of their lives occurred in the 1930s. The Great Depression crushed Isaac Sackler. His grocery store failed, a humiliating financial collapse that left the family destitute. According to Patrick Radden Keefe's definitive biography, Empire of Pain, Isaac gathered his 3 sons around the kitchen table and told them, "I have lost everything." He gave them a mandate that would become the family's guiding philosophy. The only thing that cannot be taken away from you is a good name and an education. He charged Arthur, the eldest, with the burden of being the new patriarch. It was Arthur's job to save the family, to ensure that a Sackler would never again be poor. Arthur Sackler took this charge with a ferocity that would define his entire life. He was a man of boundless, almost manic energy, a polymath who worked multiple jobs simultaneously to put himself and his younger brothers through medical school. By the 1940s, all 3 brothers had achieved the immigrant dream. They were doctors. Arthur, in particular, was a brilliant psychiatrist, completing his residency at the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens. It was at Creedmoor that Arthur began to develop a philosophy that would revolutionize medicine. At the time, American psychiatry was dominated by Freudian psychoanalysis, which held that mental illness was the result of childhood trauma and repressed desires. Arthur despised Freud. He was a biological psychiatrist, a firm believer that the mind was merely chemistry. He believed that mental anguish, and by extension physical pain, was not a failure of the soul, but a failure of the molecules. And if the problem was chemical, the solution must be chemical. He was looking for a magic bullet, a pill that could fix the human condition. But Arthur Sackler had a secret. He was not just a doctor. He was a hustler. While working his shifts at the asylum, he was moonlighting in a completely different industry, advertising. To support his family, he had taken a job at a small specialized ad agency called William Douglas McAdams. In the 1940s, medical advertising was a staid, boring business. Drug companies sold medicines like commodities, placing dry, factual notices in medical journals. Arthur Sackler saw an opportunity that no one else saw. He realized that doctors were not just scientists, they were consumers. They could be seduced, persuaded, and manipulated just like a housewife buying soap or a man buying a car. He applied the aggressive psychological tactics of consumer advertising to the world of medicine. Arthur's genius was to bypass the patient entirely and target the prescriber. He understood that the doctor was the gatekeeper. If he could convince the doctor, the patient would follow. He pioneered the strategy of direct-to-physician marketing. He hired a sales force to visit doctors' offices. He designed glossy, colorful brochures that looked like scientific journals but were actually sales pitches. He paid prominent physicians to endorse products, blurring the line between independent medical opinion and paid corporate speech. By 1947, Arthur Sackler had bought the McAdams Agency. He was now the most powerful man in medical advertising, yet he kept his name off the door to avoid scrutiny. He was effectively living a double life, a respected psychiatrist publishing papers on the biology of schizophrenia by day, and a ruthless madman of advertising by night. This conflict of interest was the foundation of his fortune. He would use his medical credentials to lend scientific legitimacy to the drugs he was paid to sell. His big break and the true birth of the modern pharmaceutical industry came in the 1950s with a new client, Pfizer. At the time, Pfizer was a chemical manufacturer trying to break into the drug business with a new antibiotic called terramycin. They hired Arthur to sell it. Arthur launched a campaign the likes of which the medical world had never seen. He didn't just place ads. He orchestrated a blitzkrieg. He flooded doctors' mailboxes with postcards and letters. He placed ads in the Journal of the American Medical Association that were so numerous they practically funded the publication. He hired a sales force of clean-cut young men to charm physicians. Most controversially, he helped arrange for scientific papers to be written endorsing the drug, papers that were often ghostwritten by his agency and signed by friendly doctors. The campaign was a sensation. Terramycin broke sales records, and Pfizer became a pharmaceutical giant. Arthur Sackler had proven his thesis. With enough marketing, you could turn a mediocre drug into a blockbuster. He had invented the hard sell for medicine. Flush with cash from his advertising empire, Arthur decided it was time for the brothers to own a company of their own. They didn't want to just sell other people's drugs, they wanted to manufacture them. In 1952, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond pooled their money to purchase a small, struggling patent medicine company in Greenwich Village called the Purdue Frederick Company. At the time, Purdue Frederick was insignificant. It sold unglamorous products like laxatives and earwax removers. It was a tiny operation with a handful of employees and revenue of less than $50,000 a year. But for the Sacklers, it was a vessel. It was a private company, wholly owned by the three brothers, which meant they did not have to answer to shareholders or disclose their finances to the SEC. It was the perfect secretive vehicle for their ambitions. While Mortimer and Raymond were installed to run Purdue, Arthur remained at his ad agency, landing the contract that would make him one of the richest men in America. In the early 1960s, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant Roche hired him to market a new class of tranquilizers, Librium and Valium. This was Arthur Sackler's masterpiece. He positioned Valium not just for people with severe anxiety, but for everyone. He marketed it as a cure for the stress of modern life. He targeted it specifically at women, creating the mother's little helper phenomenon. His ads suggested that if a patient had no physical symptoms but was simply unhappy or overwhelmed, Valium was the answer. The result was the first mass-market pharmaceutical epidemic. By the 1970s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the Western world. Roche was making billions, and Arthur Sackler, whose agency took a commission on every dollar of advertising, was making a fortune. But there was a dark side. Valium was highly addictive, a fact that Roche and Arthur Sackler consistently downplayed. When regulators and doctors began to raise alarms about the millions of housewives hooked on pills, Arthur fought back aggressively, using his network of paid experts to argue that the addiction was the fault of the patient's addictive personality, not the drug itself. This defense, blaming the patient for the drug's defects, was the exact script that his nephew, Richard Sackler, would use 40 years later to defend OxyContin. By the 1970s, the Sackler brothers had achieved the impossible. They had risen from the humiliation of their father's bankruptcy in the Great Depression to the very pinnacle of American high society. Arthur Sackler, fueled by the colossal commissions from his Valium marketing campaigns, began to construct the good name that Isaac Sackler had demanded. He became one of the world's most prolific and aggressive art collectors, amassing a hoard of Chinese antiquities and European masters that rivaled national museums. But he did not just collect art, he bought immortality. He began a systematic campaign of naming rights, donating millions to institutions on the condition that the name Sackler be displayed in perpetuity. There was the Sackler Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, home to the Temple of Dender. They were preparing to unleash a drug chemically similar to heroin on a public that had been told for decades to say no to drugs. By 1995, the development was complete. The pill was ready. The Sackler family, led by the ambitious Richard, stood on the precipice of history. They had the product, they had the patent, and thanks to Arthur, they had the evil marketing methodology. All they needed now was the permission of the federal government. They needed the FDA to say the one thing that would make them billionaires, that OxyContin was safer than other opioids. And in a triumph of lobbying and regulatory capture, that is exactly what they got. The most dangerous lie in medical history. With the FDA approval in hand, the machinery of the Sackler empire kicked into high gear. They had the magic label from the government, and now they needed to execute the sales strategy. Richard Sackler didn't just want to sell a drug. He wanted to change the way America thought about pain, and to do that, he needed an army. Richard and his team looked at the landscape of American pain and saw a vast untapped market. Millions of Americans suffered from chronic non-malignant pain, backaches, arthritis, sports injuries, fibromyalgia. For decades, doctors had treated these conditions with mild analgesics like Tylenol or aspirin, or weaker opioids like codeine. They were terrified of prescribing strong Class II narcotics like morphine or oxycodone for chronic pain because of the well-known risk of addiction. Opiophobia, as Purdue would later derisively call it, was the standard of care. Doctors were trained to believe that opioids were for short-term acute pain, like after surgery, or end-of-life care, and nothing in between. Richard Sackler's vision was to shatter this consensus. He believed that the company's proprietary Contin system, the time-release coating, was the key. His theory, which would become the central dogma of the company, was that addiction was driven by the peaks and valleys of traditional painkillers, the euphoric rush followed by the crashing withdrawal. If a pill could release the drug slowly over 12 hours, there would be no rush, no crash, and therefore, he argued, no addiction. This theory was convenient, profitable, and, as it turned out, tragically flawed. The company chose oxycodone as the active ingredient. It was cheap to produce and, unlike morphine, didn't carry the immediate stigma of death. They packed this molecule into the Contin shell in doses that were staggering. Percocet, a common painkiller, contained tiny amounts of oxycodone, usually 5 milligrams, mixed with acetaminophen to prevent abuse. Too much acetaminophen would damage the liver. Purdue's new pill, OxyContin, contained pure oxycodone in doses ranging from 10 milligrams all the way up to an 80 milligrams and eventually 160 milligrams. It was a nuclear weapon of pain relief disguised as a daily vitamin. But having the pill was not enough. To sell a narcotic this powerful to family doctors and dentists, Purdue needed the blessing of the federal government. They needed the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to officially declare that OxyContin was safer than its competitors. The approval process for OxyContin in 1995 remains one of the most controversial chapters in the history of the FDA. Purdue did not conduct long-term clinical trials to prove that the drug was less addictive or less prone to abuse than immediate-release opioids. They simply didn't have the data. Instead, they relied on the theoretical argument of the time-release mechanism. The FDA examiner in charge of the review was a man named Dr. Curtis Wright. Internal Purdue memos and emails later released during litigation show a disturbingly cozy relationship between the company and the regulator. Purdue executives essentially camped out at a hotel near the FDA headquarters in Maryland, helping Wright draft the review documents. In late 1995, the FDA handed Purdue a gift worth billions of dollars. They approved OxyContin, and in a move that was unprecedented for a Schedule II narcotic, they allowed Purdue to place a specific sentence on the package insert, the label that doctors read to understand a drug. The label stated delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. That single sentence was the cornerstone of the entire empire. It was the magic words. Note the phrasing, is believed to reduce. It did not say is proven to reduce. There were no studies to back it up. It was a hypothesis enshrined as federal regulatory fact. But for a sales rep sitting in a doctor's office, it was gold. It allowed them to look a physician in the eye and say, the FDA says this is safer. The FDA says this is less addictive. Crucially, Dr. Curtis Wright, the man who signed off on this label, left the FDA shortly after the approval. Within a year, he had taken a high-paying job at Purdue Pharma with a starting compensation package of nearly $400,000. The revolving door between the regulator and the regulated had spun, and the Sacklers had walked through it with the keys to the American kingdom. With the FDA approval in hand, Purdue Pharma prepared for the launch. This was not going to be a standard rollout. Richard Sackler and his team, drawing on the evil marketing playbook invented by Arthur Sackler 50 years earlier, planned a military-style invasion of the American medical system. They were not just launching a drug, they were launching a movement. They began to recruit a massive army of sales representatives targeting young, attractive, and hungry recruits, promising them unlimited bonuses if they could persuade doctors to start prescribing. They bought data, vast troves of prescription records, to identify the doctors who were already prescribing opioids heavily. These whales, often general practitioners in poor rural areas, would become the primary targets. By 1996, the stage was set. The factories in Totowa, New Jersey, were humming. The sales force was trained. The FDA label was printed. The Sackler family safe in their estates in Connecticut and mansions in London, waited for the money to roll in. They believed they had created the perfect product, a pill that could cure pain, a condition that afflicted millions. They did not let themselves see that they had actually manufactured a time bomb, one that was ticking in the medicine cabinets of unsuspecting families across Appalachia and the Rust Belt. The commercial launch of OxyContin in 1996 was not a typical pharmaceutical rollout. It was a sophisticated, well-funded cultural crusade designed to fundamentally rewrite the rules of American medicine. Richard Sackler and his lieutenants at Purdue Pharma understood that simply putting a new drug on the pharmacy shelf was not enough. To achieve the massive sales figures they envisioned, they had to alter the very psychology of the American doctor. They had to manufacture a sense of moral urgency around the prescribing of opioids. To do this, they co-opted a burgeoning movement in the medical community that sought to treat pain more aggressively. Purdue poured millions of dollars into organizations like the American Pain Society and the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations. These groups, heavily funded by corporate grants, began to champion a new clinical standard: pain is the fifth vital sign. This slogan, which soon appeared on posters in hospitals across the country, demanded that doctors measure a patient's pain with the same objective rigor as they measured blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and breathing. It transformed a subjective feeling into a clinical metric that required an immediate chemical intervention. To deliver this intervention, Purdue assembled a sales force that operated less like medical educators and more like an elite, bonus-driven paramilitary unit. Between 1996 and 2002, the company more than doubled the size of its sales team, recruiting young, attractive, and fiercely competitive representatives who were motivated by a compensation structure that was unprecedented in the industry. Unlike typical pharma bonuses, which were capped, Purdue's commissions were uncapped. A rep who could convince a doctor in rural Kentucky or Maine to switch patients from generic painkillers to high-dose OxyContin could earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. The company tracked these prescriptions with a predatory precision, purchasing vast troves of data from firms like IMS Health. This data allowed Purdue to identify exactly which doctors were already prescribing opioids heavily, the whales, and target them with relentless visits. These targeted physicians were rarely cancer specialists or pain experts. They were overwhelmingly general practitioners, dentists, and family doctors in working-class communities, medical professionals who had little training in addiction and were often overwhelmed by patients complaining of chronic pain. The persuasion campaign extended far beyond the doctor's office. Purdue orchestrated thousands of all-expenses-paid pain conferences at luxury resorts in places like Boca Raton, Florida, and Scottsdale, Arizona. Physicians were flown in, wined, dined, and treated to rounds of golf, all under the guise of continuing medical education. At these symposia, they were lectured by key opinion leaders, prominent doctors on Purdue's payroll, who preached the gospel of OxyContin. The central tenet of these lectures was a profound and deadly lie, that the risk of addiction to opioids was less than 1%. To support this claim, Purdue's marketers weaponized a 5-sentence letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980 by Dr. Herschel Jick and Jane Porter. And Jane, the letter, which referred only to hospitalized patients given narcotics in a controlled setting, was twisted into proof that long-term opioid use for chronic conditions was safe. Purdue cited this single obscure paragraph as if it were a landmark clinical trial, reassuring thousands of skeptical doctors that their fears of addiction were antiquated myths. This strategy of vertical integration allowed Purdue to control not just the manufacture of the pill, but the entire ecosystem of information surrounding it. They created and funded grassroots organizations with names like Partners Against Pain, which purported to advocate for the rights of suffering patients, but effectively functioned as AstroTurf lobbying groups for the company. These groups pressured state medical boards to relax restrictions on opioid prescribing, arguing that denying a patient OxyContin was a form of patient abuse. The company flooded doctors' offices with branded swag, OxyContin fishing hats, plush toys, clocks, and golf balls, normalizing the presence of a Schedule II narcotic in the everyday landscape of primary care. The marketing was so pervasive and effective that doctors began to prescribe the drug for everything from wisdom tooth extractions to lower back injuries, convinced by the FDA-approved label and the company's glossy brochures that the time-release mechanism made the drug impervious to abuse. The financial results of this total war on opiophobia were immediate and staggering. In its first year, OxyContin generated $48 million in sales. By 2000, that figure had exploded to nearly $1.1 billion. Purdue Pharma had achieved the holy grail of the pharmaceutical industry, a blockbuster drug that was taken daily, often for years, by millions of consumers. The Sackler family, who owned 100% of the private company, watched as their wealth compounded at a rate that rivaled the robber barons of the Gilded Age. In the boardrooms of Stamford, Connecticut, the mood was euphoric. They had, they believed, solved the riddle of pain. But out in the coal towns of Appalachia and the fishing villages of Maine, the first signs of the catastrophe were already appearing. The time-release coating, the magic technology that was supposed to prevent abuse, was not magic at all. It was merely a barrier, and like any barrier, it could be broken. The flaw in Richard Sackler's billion-dollar master plan was physical, simple, and devastating. The entire premise of OxyContin's safety and the basis for the FDA's crucial label rested on the Contin time-release coating. The theory was that because the drug was released slowly over 12 hours, it would not produce the euphoric rush that addicts craved, and therefore would not be abused. This theory held true only as long as the pill was swallowed whole. But in the real world, outside the controlled environment of clinical theory, users quickly discovered a terrifying vulnerability. The protective coating was nothing more than a thin, fragile shell. If you licked the coating off or simply crushed the pill with the back of a spoon, the time-release mechanism was instantly destroyed. In that moment of destruction, the safe medical device transformed into a deadly weapon. A crushed 80-milligram OxyContin pill did not release its payload over 12 hours. It released it all at once. This was a massive concentrated dose of pure oxycodone, a hit that was chemically almost indistinguishable from heroin. Users could snort the powder or dissolve it in water and inject it, achieving a high that was more powerful, more consistent, and far more accessible than street drugs. In the coalfields of Virginia, the fishing towns of Maine, and the Rust Belt of Ohio, word spread with the speed of a virus. The new miracle pill from the doctor wasn't just for back pain, it was hillbilly heroin. By the late 1990s, the first red flares of the catastrophe were already visible to those willing to look. In rural communities, pharmacies began to be robbed, not for cash, but for OxyContin. Police chiefs in small towns noticed a sudden, inexplicable spike in property crime and overdose deaths among young people who had no history of drug abuse. Emergency rooms began to fill with patients suffering from opioid withdrawal, desperate for more of the pills their doctors had prescribed. Inside the gleaming headquarters of Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut, the executives were not blind to this. Internal emails and reports, which would remain hidden for decades, show that the company was receiving early warnings from its own sales representatives. Reps in the field reported seeing pill mills, clinics where the parking lots were full of out-of-state license plates, and patients lined up around the block to pay cash for prescriptions. They reported doctors who were prescribing the highest doses of the drug in quantities that defied medical logic. But rather than sounding the alarm or recalling the drug, Purdue Pharma, under the direction of the Sackler family, doubled down. They adopted a strategy of aggressive denial and victim blaming that would define their response for the next 20 years. In internal memos, Richard Sackler was explicit. He did not view the addiction crisis as a failure of his product. He viewed it as a failure of the criminal population taking it. "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible," he wrote in a confidential email. "They are the culprits and the problem. They are the reckless criminals." This narrative was crucial to protecting the bottom line. If the drug was addictive because of its chemical structure, Purdue was liable. But if the addiction was the fault of bad people who were misusing a good medicine, then Purdue was innocent. The company began to aggressively propagate this pseudo-addiction theory. They argued that patients showing signs of drug-seeking behavior weren't actually addicted. They were simply in pain and needed more opioids. This dangerous circular logic encouraged doctors to increase dosages for patients who were already spiraling into dependency. By the turn of the millennium, the strategy had worked beyond their wildest dreams. In 2000, OxyContin sales hit the $1 billion mark. The drug had become the most successful painkiller in history. The Sackler family was now immensely, staggeringly wealthy, their fortune secured by a steady stream of cash from millions of American prescriptions. They had successfully educated the medical profession, captured the regulatory agencies, and silenced the early critics. The corporate machine was humming with perfect efficiency. But the year 2000 also marked the end of the golden era of plausible deniability. The localized brush fires of addiction in Appalachia were merging into a national inferno. The barrier of the time-release coding had been shattered, and the barrier of their corporate secrecy was about to be tested. The rise of OxyContin was complete. The era of the epidemic had begun. The family had built their empire, but they had built it on a fault line of human misery that was about to crack wide open, licensed to kill. By the dawn of the new millennium, the American landscape had changed, though few in the coastal cities or the corridors of Washington, D.C. had yet noticed. A quiet, invisible plague was sweeping through the rural heartland, moving along the spines of the Appalachian Mountains, through the coal fields of West Virginia, the fishing wharves of Maine, and the Rust Belt towns of Ohio and Kentucky. It was a plague that traveled not by air or water, but by prescription pad. The miracle of OxyContin, the safe painkiller that Richard Sackler had promised would revolutionize medicine, was indeed revolutionizing it, but not in the way he had publicly claimed. It was creating a new demographic of drug addict, the grandmother with a bad hip, the high school football star with a torn rotator cuff, the coal miner with a crushed vertebrae. These were not the junkies of the popular imagination. They were the bedrock of the American working class, and they were dying in numbers that defied statistical explanation. The year 2001 marked the tipping point where the localized brush fires of addiction merged into a national inferno. In rural counties like Lee County, Virginia, and Washington County, Maine, crime rates skyrocketed. Pharmacies were being burglarized at gunpoint not for cash, but for the bottles of OxyContin 80 milligram pills locked in the safe. police chiefs and coroners, men who had spent their lives dealing with alcohol and domestic disputes, were suddenly overwhelmed by bodies. They were finding teenagers dead in their bedrooms and fathers dead in their trucks, their lungs stopped by a respiratory depression caused by a massive overdose of OxyContin. The drug had earned a dark new nickname on the street, hillbilly heroin. Inside the gleaming glass and steel headquarters of Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut, the mood was not one of alarm but of defensive aggression. The Sackler family and their executives were acutely aware of the rising body count. As early as February 2001, a federal prosecutor in Virginia, J. McCloskey, had written to the company warning them that their drug was decimating entire communities. I have never seen a drug that has caused so much crime and so much social distress in such a short period of time, he wrote. But Richard Sackler, now the president of the company, refused to accept that the product was at fault. In his worldview, the pill was perfect. It was the people who were flawed. In a series of confidential emails sent in early 2001, later unearthed during the litigation, Richard Sackler laid out the strategy that would define the company's response for the next decade. He did not propose recalling the drug or redesigning the easily crushed pill. Instead, he proposed a campaign to demonize the victims. "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible," he wrote to his lieutenants. "They are the culprits and the problem. They are the reckless criminals." This was not a casual remark. It was a strategic directive. The company's PR machine shifted into high gear to frame the crisis not as a public health emergency caused by a dangerous pharmaceutical, but as a law enforcement issue caused by bad apples who were misusing a good medicine. To execute this strategy, Purdue deployed a tactic known as the revolving door. When J. McCloskey, the U.S. attorney in Maine, who had sounded the alarm, left government service, Purdue hired him. They paid him a significant retainer to represent the company, effectively silencing one of their most dangerous critics by putting him on the payroll. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. DEA officials, FDA regulators, and prosecutors who challenged the company were frequently courted and hired, their insider knowledge weaponized to protect the empire of pain. But the reality on the ground was becoming impossible to spin. The abuse of OxyContin was not limited to reckless criminals snorting crushed pills. Patients who took the drug exactly as prescribed, swallowing the pill whole, were also spiraling into addiction. The problem lay in the company's central marketing claim, 12-hour relief. Purdue marketed OxyContin as a twice-a-day pill, a convenience that distinguished it from cheaper short-acting generics that had to be taken every 4 hours. This 12-hour duration was the justification for the drug's high price. However, internal company documents revealed that Purdue knew, long before the drug hit the market, that the 12-hour claim was chemically optimistic. For a significant percentage of patients, the drug wore off after 8 or 9 hours. This created a phenomenon known as end-of-dose failure. Patients would wake up in the morning in withdrawal agony, their bodies screaming for more opioids. When they complained to their doctors, Purdue's sales representatives had a ready-made answer, scripted by the marketing department. Don't lower the dose or shorten the interval, increase the dose. This advice, driven by the need to protect the 12-hour marketing slogan, pushed patients onto higher and higher milligram strengths, deepening their physical dependence and accelerating the cycle of addiction. By 2002, the crisis had attracted the attention of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. The agency's data showed a terrifying correlation. Wherever Purdue's sales reps were most active, overdose deaths followed. In a rare move, the DEA began to publicly criticize the company's aggressive marketing, but Purdue fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal. They leveraged their immense political influence, hiring high-powered lobbyists in Washington to pressure the DEA to back down. They argued that any restriction on opioid prescribing would punish legitimate pain patients, a group they claimed numbered in the millions. They hid behind the human shields of cancer patients and grandmotherly arthritis sufferers, accusing the DEA of heartlessness. This period also saw the rise of a new, darker element in the pharmaceutical ecosystem, the pill mill. These were pain clinics, often located in strip malls in Florida and Ohio, that existed solely to dispense opioids. They were cash-only operations where doctors, some of whom had lost their licenses in other states, would write prescriptions for hundreds of OxyContin pills after a cursory 2-minute exam. Purdue Pharma knew about these clinics. Their own sales data highlighted individual pharmacies in towns of 3,000 people that were ordering more OxyContin than entire hospitals in New York City. A responsible company would have cut off the supply. Purdue did the opposite. They sent sales reps to these high-volume prescribers to encourage them to write even more, offering bonuses and incentives to keep the whales happy. The Sacklers were not just passive beneficiaries of this diversion. Their company was the primary supplier to a black market that was operating in plain sight. The tragedy of the early 2000s was that the medical establishment, blinded by Purdue's funding and education, largely facilitated the epidemic. Good, well-meaning doctors, convinced by the less than 1% addiction risk lie, continued to prescribe the drug for minor injuries. They believed they were practicing compassionate medicine. It wasn't until 2003 and 2004, as the death toll mounted and the stories of shattered families began to fill the local newspapers, that the tide of public opinion began to turn. Lawsuits began to trickle in, first from individuals, then from small towns, accusing Purdue of fraud and negligence. The merchants of death, as some activists began to call them, were finally being dragged into the light. But the Sacklers, insulated by their billions and their distance from the daily operations, remained untouchable, confident that their army of lawyers could crush any challenge. They did not yet realize that they had awakened a sleeping giant. The United States Department of Justice was beginning to build a case. The legal storm that broke over Purdue Pharma in the mid-2000s originated not in Washington, D.C., but in the unlikely locale of Abingdon, Virginia. It was here that John Brownlee, a young, tenacious United States attorney for the Western District of Virginia, began to pull at the loose threads of the company's corporate veil. Brownlee was investigating the devastation of the opioid crisis in his district, a region where overdose rates had soared by 300% in just a few years. What he found was a pattern of deception that went far deeper than rogue doctors or pill mills. His investigators uncovered a cache of internal documents that proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Purdue Pharma had lied to the federal government, the medical community, and the American public. The smoking gun evidence centered on the company's knowledge of abuse. For years, Purdue executives had publicly testified to Congress and the FDA that they had no idea OxyContin was being abused until the media reports surfaced in 2000. Brownlee's team found documents proving this was false. They discovered focus group reports from as early as 1995, before the drug was even launched, in which doctors warned Purdue that the pill would be abused. They found internal memos from 1996 and 1997 discussing street value and the ease with which the pills could be crushed and snorted. Most damning of all, they found that Purdue's own medical director had used the words "very scary" to describe the potential for addiction. Yet the marketing machine had continued to push the less than 1% addiction lie. Faced with the prospect of a federal criminal indictment, Purdue Pharma did not seek to cooperate. They sought to crush the investigation. The Sackler family and the board authorized a scorched earth legal defense. They hired the most expensive politically connected lawyers in America, including Mary Jo White, a former U.S. attorney, and Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, who was then running for president of the United States. This legal dream team did not argue the facts of the case, which were indefensible. Instead, they leveraged their political influence to bypass John Brownlee entirely. They called high-ranking officials at Main Justice in Washington, D.C., attempting to get the investigation shut down from the top. They argued that indicting a major pharmaceutical company would destabilize the market and deny pain relief to suffering patients. It was a naked display of power, a test of whether a corporation could be too big and too rich to jail. The pressure on Brownlee was immense, but he refused to fold. In 2006, he prepared to indict Purdue Pharma and its top 3 executives, CEO Michael Friedman, General Counsel Howard Udell, and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Paul Goldenheim, on felony charges of fraud, conspiracy, and misbranding. The threat of a felony conviction was an existential one for Purdue. Under U.S. law, a pharmaceutical company convicted of a felony is automatically barred from doing business with the government, meaning they would lose Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, a death sentence for the business. The Sacklers, watching from the boardroom, faced a critical decision. To save the golden goose of OxyContin, they had to cut a deal. In May 2007, a settlement was reached that would go down as one of the most controversial moments in the history of American justice. Purdue Pharma agreed to plead guilty to a federal felony, misbranding a drug with the intent to defraud or mislead. The company agreed to pay a fine of $600 million, one of the largest penalties ever levied against a pharmaceutical firm at the time. However, the devil was in the details. To preserve the company's ability to operate, the felony plea was technically entered by a holding company, the Purdue Frederick Company, rather than the operating arm, Purdue Pharma. This legal sleight of hand allowed the business to continue selling OxyContin without interruption. The 3 executives, Friedman, Udell, and Goldenheim, agreed to plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge of misbranding as responsible corporate officers. They were sentenced to probation and community service, avoiding prison time, though their careers were effectively ended. But the most significant aspect of the 2007 plea deal was who was missing from it. The name Sackler appeared nowhere in the indictment. The family had successfully insulated themselves. They had used their executives as human shields. Michael Friedman and his colleagues took the fall, accepting criminal records to protect the owners. In exchange for paying the fine, a sum that represented less than 6 months of OxyContin profits, the Sacklers secured a non-prosecution agreement for themselves. They bought their immunity. To the public, it looked like justice had been served. The company had confessed and paid a massive fine, but in reality, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. The family had managed to settle the criminal case without admitting any personal wrongdoing, without testifying in court, and crucially, without having to give up a single share of their company. The 2007 guilty plea should have been the end of the OxyContin story. Instead, in a display of corporate hubris that defies belief, it marked the beginning of the drug's most aggressive and cynical phase. The $600 million fine, which the Sacklers paid without blinking, was not a deterrent. It was merely a toll booth on the road to even greater riches. In the years immediately following the conviction, 2008, 2009, and 2010, Purdue Pharma did not retreat. They turbocharged their sales engine. The company, knowing that their non-addictive marketing claim was now legally dead, pivoted to a new, more insidious strategy, targeting the whales. Internal databases, later revealed in court, showed that Purdue maintained incredibly detailed dossiers on every prescribing doctor in America. They knew exactly who the highest prescribers were, often physicians in strip malls in Florida or pain clinics in Appalachia who were writing thousands of scripts a month. A responsible company would have flagged these doctors as dangerous pill mills and cut them off. Purdue did the opposite. They directed their sales representatives to visit these specific doctors more often, sometimes weekly, to ensure the flow of pills continued. This was the era of the turbocharged sales contest. Sales reps were competing for trips to Hawaii and exorbitant bonuses based on the volume of milligrams they could move. The message from the Sackler Controlled Board was clear: sell as much as possible, as fast as possible, before the regulatory window closes completely. It was during this specific period, after they had already pleaded guilty to federal crimes, that the Sackler family voted to pay themselves the vast majority of their fortune. Of the approximately $10 billion plus they withdrew from the company over its lifetime, the bulk was siphoned out during these desperate, high-volume years between 2008 and 2010. They were effectively looting their own ship while steering it into an iceberg. But the family had one final card to play, a move they framed as a humanitarian triumph, but which would result in a demographic catastrophe. It was called reformulation. By 2010, the patent on the original OxyContin was expiring. This meant generic drug makers could soon flood the market with cheap versions of the drug, destroying Purdue's profits. To stop this, the Sacklers needed a new patent. They instructed their scientists to create a new version of the pill, OxyContin OP, that was physically harder to crush. It turned into a gummy gel if smashed, making it difficult to snort or inject. In August 2010, Purdue released this new version and successfully lobbied the FDA to ban the old, generic versions, arguing they were unsafe. It was a brilliant commercial maneuver. It extended their patent monopoly for another decade, locking out generic competitors under the guise of public safety. However, the law of unintended consequences was about to strike with terrifying force. When the new uncrushable pills hit the streets in late 2010, the millions of Americans who were physically dependent on the drug faced a crisis. They could no longer get high by snorting the new pills, but they were still addicted. Their brain chemistry had been fundamentally rewritten by the Sackler's product. They could not simply stop. Sick with withdrawal, desperate for a fix, these millions of customers looked for a substitute, and the Mexican drug cartels were waiting for them. Specifically, a group known as the Jalisco Boys from Nayarit, Mexico, had set up a sophisticated distribution network in the exact same rural, white, working-class towns that Purdue had targeted. They offered black tar heroin. It was cheap, often $10 a balloon compared to $80 for a pill. It was potent, and crucially, it was smokable or injectable. The migration was almost instantaneous. In 2011 and 2012, overdose rates didn't drop. They exploded. But the cause of death shifted. The prescription opioid epidemic morphed into a heroin epidemic. This was the Sacklers' final tragic legacy of the decade. They had created a market of addicts with a pharmaceutical product, and when they pulled that product away to protect their patent, they effectively handed that customer base over to the drug cartels. The grandmother who started on OxyContin for arthritis in 2001 was, by 2011, a statistic in the heroin crisis. By the end of 2010, the trap was fully sprung. The Sacklers had extracted their billions and moved the money offshore. They had secured a new patent. They had settled with the government. They believed they had won. They did not realize that by pushing their customers from pills to heroin, they had ignited a level of carnage that would make their name not just famous, but infamous. The bodies were piling up too fast to hide, and the era of the epidemic was about to give way to the era of the fall, from billionaires to pariahs. By 2011, the catastrophe was undeniable. The shift to heroin caused by the 2010 reformulation had turned a prescription pill crisis into an illicit drug slaughter. While bodies piled up in the morgues of Ohio and West Virginia, the Sacklers entered what could be called their silent era, a period of secretive legal battles and frantic asset protection. While this public health catastrophe metastasized, Purdue Pharma was fighting a secret war in the courtrooms of Appalachia to keep its past crimes hidden. The most significant battle of this era took place in Pike County, Kentucky. The state of Kentucky had filed a lawsuit against Purdue, alleging that the company had devastated the region. This lawsuit was dangerous because it threatened to expose the internal documents from the previous decade, the marketing plans and emails that the 2007 federal plea deal had managed to keep sealed. Throughout 2013, the Sacklers' lawyers fought a brutal battle of attrition against the state of Kentucky. They knew that if the discovery documents, millions of pages of internal communications, were ever made public, the family's reputation would be destroyed. They delayed, filed motions, and used every procedural trick in the book. Finally, in December 2015, just as the case was heading to a trial that would have laid the family's secrets bare, Purdue agreed to pay Kentucky $24 million to settle the case. It was a paltry sum for a multi-billion-dollar company, but it bought something priceless: secrecy. As part of the deal, the millions of pages of incriminating documents were destroyed or sealed. The Sacklers had once again used their checkbook to bury the truth. They believed they had successfully cauterized the wound, purchasing another decade of immunity. Secure in the belief that their secrets were safe, the family turned their attention to expanding their fortune in 2014. This was the year that the board of Purdue Pharma, dominated by the Sackler family, including Mortimer D.A. Sackler and Kathy Sackler, engaged in discussions that revealed the depth of their cynicism. With OxyContin sales finally beginning to plateau due to the saturation of the market, they sought new revenue streams. They did not look to non-opioid pain relievers. Instead, they looked at the very crisis they had created. This was the birth of the internal strategy known as Project Tango. In confidential board meetings throughout 2014 and 2015, the family reviewed charts and graphs that depicted the American opioid consumer as a captive ecosystem. They realized that they had successfully monetized the start of the addiction cycle with OxyContin. Now, they planned to monetize the end of it. Project Tango was a plan to become a dominant player in the addiction treatment market. The family explored acquiring companies that produce buprenorphine, a drug used to treat withdrawal, and naloxone, the overdose reversal drug. The internal presentation decks were chillingly clinical. One slide overlaid the declining sales of pain pills with the rising sales of addiction cures, creating a cross shape that identified the sweet spot for investment. The Sacklers were, in effect, planning to sell the poison and the antidote simultaneously. They calculated that they could profit from the patient at every stage of their downward spiral. from the first prescription for back pain to the frantic attempt to get clean in a rehab clinic. Although the project was never fully publicly launched as a standalone business, the fact that it was debated at the highest levels of the board demonstrated a total lack of moral culpability. To the Sacklers, the overdose crisis was not a tragedy. It was a market inefficiency to be corrected for profit. While the family plotted their next windfall, the external environment began to shift against them in 2015 and 2016. The wall of silence they had bought in Kentucky began to crack, not in a courtroom, but in the press. In 2016, the Los Angeles Times published a groundbreaking investigation titled, "You Want a 12-Hour High?" Reporters had obtained internal Purdue documents that had leaked, despite the sealing orders. For the first time, the public learned about the 12-hour lie. The investigation revealed that Purdue had known for decades that their pill did not last 12 hours for many people, and that the company had instructed doctors to increase the dose rather than the frequency, a practice that fueled addiction. This report was a watershed moment. It stripped away the scientific defense of the drug. It proved that the Sacklers' core marketing claim was a fabrication designed to protect their patent and justify the drug's high price. Simultaneously, in March 2016, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, took a historic step. For the first time, the federal government issued strict guidelines urging doctors to avoid prescribing opioids for chronic pain. This was a direct repudiation of the entire pain is the fifth vital sign movement that Arthur and Richard Sackler had spent millions to build. The CDC effectively declared that the Sackler philosophy of medicine was dangerous and scientifically unsound. These two events in 2016, the journalistic expose and the regulatory crackdown, marked the turning point. The era of plausible deniability was ending. The Sacklers could no longer claim that they were selling a safe drug or that they were following best medical practices. The science and the press had turned against them. Sensing the shift in the wind, the Sackler family accelerated a financial strategy that had been running quietly in the background. Beginning in earnest around 2008, but ramping up significantly between 2015 and 2017, the family began to loot their own company. They knew that the lawsuits were coming. They knew that the $24 million settlement in Kentucky was just the first drop of rain before the hurricane. So they began to empty the treasury. In board meeting after board meeting, the family members voted to distribute the company's profits directly to themselves. The scale of these transfers was staggering. Millions and eventually billions of dollars were moved from Purdue Pharma's accounts in the United States to the family's personal holding companies and trusts in tax havens like Jersey, Luxembourg, and the British Virgin Islands. In one instance, later identified by investigators, a single transfer of $60 million was wired to a personal account. They bought real estate in London, chalets in Gstaad, and diversified their holdings into hedge funds and private equity, effectively laundering the OxyContin money into the clean, global financial system. By 2017, they had siphoned an estimated $10 billion out of Purdue Pharma. They had hollowed out the corporation, leaving behind a shell loaded with legal liabilities, while the bulk of the wealth was safely stashed overseas, theoretically, beyond the reach of American courts. This was the state of play as the year 2017 drew to a close. The Sacklers were wealthier than ever, their billions safely offshore. They believed they had won the game of capitalism, but they had forgotten one vulnerability. They had spent 50 years putting their name on museums to buy respectability. And in October 2017, a writer named Patrick Radden Keefe published an article in the New Yorker magazine titled "The Family That Built an Empire of Pain." This article changed everything. For the first time, a major mainstream publication explicitly linked the Sackler name on the museum walls to the OxyContin crisis in the streets. It connected the dots between Arthur's marketing genius, Richard's aggressive sales tactics, and the body count. It made the Sacklers famous in the one way they had always feared. It made them villains. The publication of Patrick Radden Keefe's investigative biography in late 2017 was the spark that lit the fuse of public outrage, but it was an artist who fanned the flames into an inferno. Nan Goldin, a legendary photographer known for her raw documentation of the AIDS crisis, had recently emerged from her own personal hell of OxyContin addiction. She had survived an overdose in rehab, and she emerged with a singular clarity. The name Sackler was not a synonym for art, it was a synonym for death. In early 2018, Goldin founded the activist group PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now. Her strategy was radical and brilliant. She understood that protesting at Purdue's corporate fortress in Stamford was useless. The executives there were insulated. Instead, she targeted the family's vanity. She brought the opioid crisis into the temples of high culture where the Sacklers felt most safe. On March 10, 2018, Goldin and dozens of activists staged a die-in at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They marched into the Sackler Wing, the vast glass-enclosed hall housing the Temple of Dindur, the very space Arthur Sackler had purchased to immortalize his name. At a signal, the protesters threw hundreds of orange prescription bottles into the reflective pool surrounding the temple. They unfurled banners that read "Shame on Sackler" and "Fund Rehab, Not Museums." The imagery was devastating. It went viral globally, shattering the philanthropic shield the family had spent 50 years constructing. For the first time, the directors of the world's most prestigious museums were forced to confront a moral question. Was their funding composed of blood money? The protests sparked a chain reaction. Similar actions followed at the Guggenheim in New York and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Sacklers, who had viewed their donations as a purchase of social immunity, suddenly found that their good name was becoming a liability. While Goldin was dismantling their social standing, a far more dangerous threat was materializing in the legal arena. For decades, Purdue Pharma had successfully fought off individual lawsuits by outspending plaintiffs. But in 2018, the nature of the plaintiff changed. The states were stepping in. A new generation of aggressive state attorneys general, recognizing the trillions of dollars in social costs inflicted by the epidemic, began to build massive cases against the company. Leading the charge was Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts. Healey had access to the internal documents that had been buried in previous settlements, and she made a strategic decision that would change the course of the war. She decided that suing the corporation was not enough. In June 2018, Maura Healey filed a landmark lawsuit that did the unthinkable. She named 8 individual members of the Sackler family as defendants. This was the moment the legal veil was pierced. The lawsuit named the matriarchs and patriarchs, Richard Sackler, Cathy Sackler, Mortimer D.A. Sackler, Jonathan Sackler, and others. It alleged that they were not passive investors, but active micromanagers of the scheme. Healey's complaint was a 300-page indictment of the family's personal conduct. It quoted for the first time publicly the internal emails that revealed their disdain for the victims. It publicized Richard Sackler's 2001 demand to hammer on the abusers and call them reckless criminals. It revealed that Cathy Sackler had personally participated in ride-alongs with sales reps to push the drug. It showed that the family received weekly granular reports on OxyContin sales and pushed for higher targets even as the death toll mounted. The Massachusetts complaint was a revelation. It proved that the Sacklers were effectively running a criminal enterprise from the boardroom. The illusion of separation between the beneficent family and the corporate entity was destroyed. Following Massachusetts' lead, the floodgates opened. New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and eventually nearly every state in the Union filed similar suits. The legal theory shifted to public nuisance, the idea that the Sacklers had polluted the public health environment just as a factory pollutes a river. The potential liability was no longer in the millions. It was in the trillions. By late 2018, the Sackler family faced a unified national assault on their personal fortune. They were being sued by the governments of the places where they lived and did business. The walls of their impunity were crumbling. Sensing the existential threat, the family retreated to their bunker to finalize their escape plan. The looting of the company, which had begun years earlier, reached its frenzied conclusion. Financial forensics would later show that even as the lawsuits were being filed in 2018, the family continued to authorize massive cash transfers from Purdue Pharma to their offshore trusts. They were stripping the assets to ensure that when the judgment day came, the company would be an empty shell. But they needed a way to stop the lawsuits. The litigation in state courts was moving toward jury trials that would be televised, trials where family members would be forced to take the stand, trials that would result in verdicts that could wipe out their entire wealth. They needed a legal mechanism to freeze everything, to force all 50 states into a single room where a deal could be cut. They found their solution in the United States Bankruptcy Code. In early 2019, rumors began to swirl that Purdue Pharma was preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. To the public, this sounded like a defeat, an admission that the company was broke. But to the Sacklers and their army of lawyers at the firm Davis Polk, it was a strategic weapon. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy is designed to allow a company to restructure its debts and survive. But it comes with a powerful feature, the automatic stay. The moment a company files for bankruptcy, all litigation against it stops. The Sacklers' plan was audacious. They would have Purdue Pharma file for bankruptcy. They, the family members, would not file for bankruptcy. Their personal billions would remain safe in their personal accounts. However, they would ask the bankruptcy judge to extend the automatic stay to cover them as well, arguing that the lawsuits against the family were inextricably linked to the company. If successful, this maneuver would freeze Maura Healey, the New York Attorney General, and thousands of other plaintiffs in their tracks. It would move the battle from state courts, where the Sacklers were losing, to a single federal bankruptcy courtroom, where there were no juries, and where the primary goal was efficient resolution rather than moral justice. In March 2019, attempting to head off this inevitable filing, the state of Oklahoma managed to force a settlement. The Oklahoma Attorney General, Mike Hunter, had a trial date set for May. He was ready to put the Sacklers on the stand. Terrified of the cameras, the Sacklers blinked. They authorized Purdue to pay $270 million to Oklahoma to settle the case. It was a massive sum, but it was a tactical sacrifice. They paid it to buy time, to prevent a televised trial that would have destroyed whatever leverage they had left. But the settlement signaled to the world that the Sacklers were afraid. It was the scent of blood in the water. 6 months later, on September 15, 2019, the trap was sprung. Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 protection in the Southern District of New York. The filing immediately triggered the legal freeze the Sacklers had engineered. The 2,600-plus lawsuits against the company or halted. And in a controversial ruling, the bankruptcy judge, Robert Drain, agreed to the Sacklers' request. He extended the protection to the family members. The Sacklers had successfully used the bankruptcy court to shield themselves from the consequences of their actions without having to declare bankruptcy themselves. They had effectively bought a federal injunction against the entire American legal system. They retreated to their estates in England and Florida, safe behind a wall of federal law, ready to negotiate the price of their freedom. The bankruptcy process that began in late 2019 was not a standard corporate reorganization. It was a hostage negotiation. The Sacklers had the money stashed offshore. The victims and the states had the moral high ground and the legal claims. The question for the next 4 years would be, how much of their blood money would the family have to give back to buy their permanent immunity? The bankruptcy proceedings that began in late 2019 and stretched through the pandemic year of 2020 were unlike any corporate restructuring in American history. Usually, a bankruptcy is a dry, mathematical exercise in dividing up a pie. This was a moral reckoning played out in a virtual courtroom. The creditors were not just hedge funds and vendors. They were 50 sovereign states, thousands of municipal governments, and, most painfully, over 130,000 individual victims. Mothers, fathers, and survivors who filed personal injury claims against the company. The Sacklers, safe in their automatic stay bunker, treated the process as a transaction. They put an offer on the table that they believed was generous. They proposed to hand over the ownership of Purdue Pharma to a public trust, a public benefit corporation, PBC, that would continue to sell OxyContin and addiction treatments, with the future profits going to pay for the cleanup of the epidemic. In addition, the family offered to pay a settlement of $3 billion in cash over 7 years. To the Sacklers, this was a king's ransom, but to the states and the victims, it was an insult. Forensic accountants hired by the creditors had by now completed their analysis of the looting. They estimated that the family's total wealth was around $11 billion, much of it safely invested in diversified global portfolios earning standard market returns. The accountants pointed out a sickening mathematical reality. At a 5% annual return, the Sacklers could pay the $3 billion fine entirely from the interest on their fortune, without ever touching their principal. They would emerge from the bankruptcy not just free, but richer than when they entered it. Furthermore, the Sacklers attached a non-negotiable condition to their offer, a legal clause known as a non-consensual third-party release. This clause was the true objective of the entire bankruptcy strategy. If approved by Judge Robert Drain, it would grant the Sackler family, including the hundreds of heirs who had never worked at Purdue, permanent global civil immunity. It was a sweeping legal shield that would extinguish every current and future lawsuit against them alleging liability for the opioid crisis. No state, no city, no hospital, and no grieving parent could ever sue them again. They were, in effect, attempting to use the bankruptcy court to purchase a permanent pardon for crimes they refused to admit committing. While these negotiations dragged on in the civil courts, the United States federal government was preparing its final salvo on the criminal side. In October 2020, the Department of Justice, DOJ, announced the conclusion of its criminal and civil investigations into Purdue Pharma. The DOJ's announcement was a thunderclap. Purdue Pharma agreed to plead guilty to 3 federal felonies, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and violating the federal anti-kickback statute for paying doctors to prescribe opioids. The company faced criminal and civil penalties totaling $8.3 billion. On paper, it was the largest pharmaceutical penalty in history. In reality, it was a paper tiger. Because Purdue was in bankruptcy, the DOJ agreed that the company did not actually have to pay the $8.3 billion. The government would step back and allow the assets to go to the victims and states instead. The felony conviction was symbolic. It was pinning a medal on a corpse. But the most controversial aspect of the DOJ deal concerned the family. The Sacklers were not charged criminally. Instead, the DOJ reached a separate civil settlement with the family members, requiring them to pay $225 million to resolve civil liability. The deal sparked immediate, bipartisan outrage in Congress. Critics pointed out that $225 million represented roughly 2% of the wealth the family had extracted from the company. It was less than the interest they earned in a single year. Activists called it a sweetheart deal that proved there were two systems of justice in America, one for the poor, who went to prison for possessing small amounts of OxyContin, and one for the billionaires who paid a 2% tax to walk away from the felonies that created the crisis. Despite the outrage, the bankruptcy process ground forward toward a resolution. The Sacklers, sensing that the political pressure was rising, agreed to sweeten their offer. They raised the cash settlement from $3 billion to $4.275 billion to be paid over 9 years. In exchange, they demanded that the immunity clause be locked in. But before the deal could be finalized, the victims demanded a moment of accountability. They demanded that the Sacklers face them. In August 2021, a historic and surreal event took place. As a condition of the mediation, Judge Drain ordered key members of the Sackler family to testify in a public, albeit virtual, hearing. For the first time in the 20-year history of the epidemic, Richard Sackler, David Sackler, and Mortimer D.A. Sackler were forced to raise their right hands and answer questions under oath about their role in the destruction of American public health. The hearing was a spectacle of profound moral disconnect. The family members appeared on screens from their various luxury estates, their faces impassive. The questioning was brutal. Lawyers for the states confronted them with their own emails, the hammer on the abuser's comments, the Project Tango charts, the directives to turbocharge sales. When asked directly if he, Richard Sackler, the architect of the drug and the former president, bore any responsibility for the opioid epidemic, his answer was a flat, unhesitating no. He blamed the management team. He blamed the FDA. He blamed the distributors. He blamed the addicts. But he accepted zero personal culpability. The family and the board acted lawfully and ethically, David Sackler testified, echoing his father. To the parents watching the live stream, parents who had found their children cold and blue in their bedrooms, the testimony was a final grievous psychological injury. It confirmed what they had long suspected. The Sacklers did not view themselves as perpetrators. They viewed themselves as victims of a public misunderstanding, benevolent philanthropists who had been unfairly targeted by a mob. Despite the chilling lack of remorse, the sheer financial pressure of the bankruptcy system began to force a conclusion. Many states, exhausted by years of litigation and desperate for funds to treat the raging addiction crisis, reluctantly agreed to the deal. They calculated that $4.5 billion now was better than a moral victory 10 years later after the Sacklers had spent every penny on lawyers. In September 2021, Judge Robert Drain, who had presided over the case with a clear preference for settlement over liquidation, issued his ruling. He acknowledged the bitterness and anger of the victims. He admitted that the Sacklers' conduct was troubling. but he argued the bankruptcy court's primary duty was to maximize the recovery for creditors. If he rejected the deal, the Sacklers would retreat to their offshore fortresses. The litigation would continue for a decade, Purdue would be liquidated for scrap, and the victims would likely get nothing. With a bang of his gavel, Judge Drain confirmed the bankruptcy plan. He granted the Sacklers their third-party releases. He gave them their permanent civil immunity. The deal was done. The Sacklers would lose their company. They would pay $4.5 billion over 9 years, and in exchange they would be free. They would remain billionaires, and they would never face a jury. It seemed, for a fleeting moment in the autumn of 2021, that the Sacklers had pulled off the ultimate escape. They had bought their way out of the fire. But the victory was illusory. The outrage over the judge-made immunity was too great. A handful of holdout entities, specifically the U.S. trustee, the DOJ's bankruptcy watchdog, and the states of Connecticut, Washington, and Maryland, refused to accept the deal. They filed an immediate appeal to the U.S. District Court. Their argument was simple and powerful. A bankruptcy court is a court of equity for debtors. The Sacklers were not debtors. They had not filed for bankruptcy. Therefore, the judge had no constitutional authority to grant them immunity from lawsuits that had nothing to do with the bankruptcy estate. They argued that the non-consensual third-party release was an illegal overreach of judicial power, a tool that allowed billionaires to hijack the bankruptcy system to protect their personal assets. In December 2021, in a stunning decision that rocked the corporate legal world, U.S. District Judge Colleen McMahon agreed with the holdouts. She issued a ruling that overturned Judge Drain's confirmation of the plan. In her blistering opinion, Judge McMahon wrote that the bankruptcy code did not authorize the court to grant releases to non-debtors, the Sacklers, over the objection of plaintiffs, the states. She effectively stripped the Sacklers of their immunity shield. The deal was dead. The settlement collapsed. The Sacklers were suddenly exposed again. Without the bankruptcy settlement, the 2,600 lawsuits could theoretically restart. The automatic stay was in jeopardy. The family faced the terrifying prospect of returning to the Wild West of state court litigation, where juries in Kentucky and West Virginia were waiting to dismantle their fortune dollar by dollar. Panic returned to the Sackler camp. They realized their leverage was gone. They had to come back to the table, and this time they had to pay more. In early 2022, a new round of intense mediation began. The Sacklers, desperate to restore their immunity shield, reached deeper into their pockets. In March 2022, a new deal was announced. The family agreed to increase their cash contribution from $4.3 billion to $6 billion. This extra $1.7 billion was enough to buy off the holdout states. Connecticut, Washington, and Maryland signed on. The weary attorneys general stood before microphones and declared that while the deal was imperfect, and while the Sacklers avoided prison, the $6 billion would do immense good in fighting the addiction crisis. The path seemed clear again. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit reviewed the new deal and, in May 2023, reversed Judge McMahon's ruling, reinstating the bankruptcy plan and the Sacklers' immunity. The court ruled that while the law was murky, exceptional circumstances justified the releases to ensure the victims got paid. The Sacklers prepared to wire the first payment. The museums prepared to receive the funds. The victims prepared to receive their meager compensation, expected to be between $3,500 and $48,000 per family. The saga, it appeared, was finally over, but there was one final supreme authority that had not yet spoken. In August 2023, just as the settlement was about to be executed, the Supreme Court of the United States intervened. In a shock move, the Supreme Court issued a stay on the entire bankruptcy plan and agreed to hear the case. The highest court in the land had decided that the question of non-consensual third-party releases, the very legal mechanism the Sacklers had used to buy their freedom, was too important and too controversial to be decided by a bankruptcy judge. They would hear the case themselves. The wait ended in June 2024. In a historic 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court of the United States dropped the hammer. They rejected the bankruptcy deal. The court ruled that American law does not allow billionaires to wipe away legal claims against them without filing for bankruptcy themselves. It was a stunning defeat for the Sacklers. The shield of immunity they had spent years and millions of dollars constructing was shattered in an instant. The deal was dead. The family was once again exposed to the full fury of the American legal system, stripped of their protection, and forced back to the negotiating table, not as masters of the universe, but as defendants with nowhere left to hide. Justice delayed. The intervention of the Supreme Court of the United States in late 2023 did more than just pause a legal settlement. It froze the entire Sackler saga in a moment of high judicial tension, suspending the final resolution of the most significant public health crisis of the modern era. As the nation moved into 2024, the ghost of OxyContin continued to haunt the American landscape, leaving behind a legacy that is far more complex and enduring than a simple bankruptcy negotiation. The empire built by Arthur Mortimer and Raymond Sackler has been physically dismantled, their company dissolved, and their name erased from the public square, but the consequences of their ambition remain embedded in the soil of the nation, in the broken trust of the medical system, and in the quiet, empty bedrooms of a lost generation. The legal question currently pending before the 9 justices in Washington is not merely a technicality of bankruptcy code. It is a fundamental referendum on the nature of justice in a capitalist democracy. The core issue, the validity of non-consensual third-party releases, cuts to the very heart of the Sackler defense strategy. If the court upholds the settlement, it will enshrine a legal precedent that allows the ultra-wealthy to effectively purchase a private justice system. It would confirm that with enough money, a complex enough corporate structure, and enough lawyers, a family can decouple their personal fortune from their corporate liability, using the bankruptcy courts to construct a firewall that no jury can ever breach. This potential precedent has terrified legal scholars and infuriated activists. It suggests a future where corporate wrongdoers can treat mass tort liability not as a moral failing or a criminal act, but as a simple business expense, a line item to be managed through a Chapter 11 filing. The Sacklers, by pioneering this strategy on such a massive scale, have potentially written the playbook for every future corporate bad actor facing catastrophic liability. Whether it is a chemical company poisoning a water supply or a tech giant violating privacy laws, the Sackler maneuver, looting the company, declaring it bankrupt, and then paying a settlement to secure personal immunity, could become the standard operating procedure of American disaster management. While the legal system wrestles with these abstract principles, the Sackler family itself exists in a strange gilded purgatory. They have retained the vast majority of the wealth they extracted from the epidemic, even if they are forced to pay the full $6 billion settlement. Forensic accountants estimate that the family will remain one of the richest dynasties in the world. Their offshore trusts in Jersey and the Caribbean are still generating investment returns that likely exceed the annual payments they are required to make. In a purely financial sense, the fall of the House of Sackler is a myth. They have not fallen, they have merely been taxed. They have successfully converted a risky operating business, Purdue Pharma, into a permanent, passive, and diversified fortune that will sustain their heirs for generations. However, they have lost the one asset that Isaac Sackler, the founding patriarch, told his sons was more important than money: their good name. The cultural erasure of the Sackler identity has been total and humiliating. The removal of their name from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, and universities across the globe is a punishment that no court could have ordered. It is a social execution. The family members who once vied for invitations to the Met Gala and the high tables of Oxford have been rendered personae non grati in the very elite circles they spent a century trying to infiltrate. They are billionaires, but they are pariahs, forced to retreat to their private estates, insulated by their wealth, but exiled from the public validation they so desperately craved. This reputational ruin is the only true accountability they have faced. It is a victory for activists like Nan Goldin, proving that while the legal system may be rigged in favor of capital, the court of public opinion can still enforce a moral penalty. The Sackler name, once intended to signify benefactor and healer, has been permanently redefined in the historical record. It now sits alongside names like Madoff or Escobar, a synonym for greed, deception, and the destruction of human life for profit. But the erasure of a name from a museum wall does nothing to erase the chemical footprint the family left on the American nervous system. The most tragic and enduring legacy of the Sackler empire is the physical alteration of millions of human brains. The opioid epidemic did not end when Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. It mutated. The wave of addiction that began with OxyContin prescriptions in 1996 has evolved into a self-perpetuating cycle of heroin and fentanyl use that continues to kill over 80,000 Americans a year. The ghost of OxyContin is visible in the foster care systems of West Virginia and Ohio, which are overwhelmed by children whose parents are dead or incarcerated. It is visible in the neonatal abstinence syndrome wards of hospitals, where babies are born shaking and screaming in withdrawal because their mothers were addicted during pregnancy. It is visible in the hollowed-out workforce of the Rust Belt, where labor participation rates among prime-age men have plummeted, a phenomenon economists have directly linked to the saturation of opioids in those communities. The Sacklers may have left the building, but the fire they started is still burning down the house. Furthermore, the Sackler legacy has fundamentally poisoned the relationship between the American public and the medical profession. For 50 years, Arthur Sackler and his descendants worked to blur the line between medicine and marketing. They turned doctors into salespeople and patients into consumers. They corrupted the regulatory agencies and co-opted the pain societies. The revelation of this systematic deception has bred a deep cynicism toward Big Pharma and the healthcare establishment. When patients today question their doctors, or when the public expresses skepticism about FDA approvals, that mistrust is, in part, a scar tissue formed by the OxyContin lies. The Sacklers didn't just sell a bad drug, they broke the bond of faith that allows medicine to function. Ultimately, the legacy of the Sackler Dynasty is a story of unintended consequences on a planetary scale. In their quest to create a safe opioid, they birthed the deadliest drug crisis in history. By marketing OxyContin as a solution to pain, they created a universe of suffering. And perhaps most ironically, by attempting to buy immortality through philanthropy, they achieved the exact opposite, a permanent historical infamy. The Sackler curse is now less about the family and more about the terrifying void they have left in the American social fabric. The billions of dollars in settlement funds, whenever they are finally released by the courts, will face a grim reality. No amount of money can retroactively fix the damage. The settlement funds are earmarked for abatement, for Narcan distribution, for rehab clinics, for education. But abatement is just management of a disaster, not a cure. The money will buy ambulances to resuscitate the overdosed. It will not buy back the lives lost. It will build orphanages for the children of addicts. It will not bring back their parents. As of 2024, the Sackler name has become a case study in business ethics classes, a cautionary tale in boardrooms, and a rallying cry for a new era of corporate accountability activism. The family has inadvertently fueled a legislative awakening. The failure to hold them criminally accountable has spurred calls for stricter laws regarding executive liability, putting future CEOs on notice that the corporate veil may not be as impenetrable as it once was. Yet, the final image of the Sackler saga is one of haunting inequality. While the legal battles restart, the family remains in their luxurious exile. They travel between their estates in England, Switzerland, and Florida, ghosts in a world they used to own. They have no company to run, no galas to attend, and no public role to play. They are trapped in a golden cage of their own making, rich beyond measure, but stripped of the one thing their patriarch, Isaac Sackler, told them mattered most. They are the wealthiest pariahs on earth, a dynasty that conquered the world of medicine only to lose their souls in the process. The Sackler name has been chiseled off the walls, but the scar it left on America will never fade.